Night, Tokyo. The air is cold and thin at 30,000 feet. Searchlights sweep the sky, their white beams clawing desperately into the darkness. Alarms wail through the sleeping city as civilians rush into shelters, eyes wide with fear. Anti-aircraft batteries thunder from rooftops and open fields, hurling steel and fire into the night. But their shells explode far below the real threat. High above the chaotic glow, silver shapes glide silently. So high their engines sound like a distant storm. To the men in the streets, they are ghosts. To Japan's fighter pilots, they are untouchable. Inside one of those aircraft, the temperature drops to freezing. Oxygen masks cling to faces. Crewmen wipe frost from their goggle lenses as they peer down at the vast, dim shape of Tokyo. The pilot gently adjusts the controls, the massive wings responding like a calm giant in the darkness. This is the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a bomber that flies where no Japanese interceptor can reach, a weapon Japan never believed was possible. And tonight, the Empire will learn just how high the Americans can soar. When the Pacific War began in 1941, Japan believed its skies were secure. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and Naval Air Service had spent years developing fast, agile fighters like the A-6M0 aircraft built to dominate dogfights in the Pacific's humid, low-altitude environments. Japanese doctrine focused on maneuverability, not altitude or protective armor. The war was expected to be fought close to the ground, over islands and ships, and early victories seemed to justify that belief. Japan swept through Asia and the Pacific. American airfields fell one after another. The Zero carved a reputation as a fearsome predator, unmatched at low and medium heights. In those days, Japan appeared to command the skies. But as the war expanded, so did America's industrial might. The United States had the factories, resources, and engineers to think bigger, beyond the immediate battlefield, beyond the current generation of aircraft, beyond the limits of conventional aviation. In 1940, even before Pearl Harbor, U.S. planners envisioned a bomber capable of flying faster, farther, and higher than any fighter in existence. A machine able to launch attacks across oceans, from bases so distant the enemy couldn't retaliate. A bomber that could strike Japan directly, something the U.S. could not do in the early war years. This vision became the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Built under immense pressure, the B-29 was unlike anything ever seen. It featured advanced R-3350 engines, pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled defensive guns, and a wingspan longer than a modern-day C-130. Its service ceiling, over 31,000 feet, was higher than any Japanese fighter could sustainably reach in combat. But Japan didn't know that yet. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the Empire's air defense strategy assumed that any American bomber attempting to reach the mainland would come from nearby short-range bases, just like the Doolittle raid. Interceptors were positioned for low and medium-altitude interception. Radar systems were scattered and limited. Japan believed the ocean itself was the primary shield. Meanwhile, the U.S. was preparing something unprecedented. Factories across America worked day and night. The B-29 program was so massive that it cost more than the Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb. Thousands of workers assembled new materials, new machinery, new aviation science. Hundreds of test flights were lost to engine fires, technical failures, and accidents. It was a race against both time and physics. If the B-29 succeeded, Japan's industrial heartland, cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, would no longer be safe. By late 1943, the first B-29 groups were training for long-range precision bombing. But the one thing they still lacked was a base close enough to Japan. Until the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were captured in mid-1944, the aircraft had nowhere to launch strategic attacks on the home islands. Japan's intelligence agencies struggled to understand the threat. Reports of a massive new American bomber reached Tokyo, but the specifications sounded impossible. Engineers insisted that such range and altitude were beyond current technology. Even when reconnaissance spotted B-29s operating over China in 1944, the Imperial Command dismissed them as prototypes or exaggerated reports. They assumed that if these bombers came, conventional fighters would bring them down easily. That was the assumption until the first major B-29 raid surprised the Japanese mainland. As formations of superfortresses appeared high above the clouds, Japan suddenly realized the war was changing. The sky was no longer theirs to control. And now, the empire would scramble to comprehend an enemy that fought from heights they had never prepared for. To understand why the B-29 terrified Japan's engineers, one must understand what made it different from every bomber before it. Most aircraft of the era were cramped, noisy, and exposed to the brutal cold of high altitude. But the B-29 introduced pressurization chambers, a breakthrough normally found only on passenger airliners. The nose, cockpit, and tail were sealed like capsules. A narrow tubular tunnel ran over the bomb bays, allowing crew members to crawl between sections while the aircraft cruised above 30,000 feet. Outside those walls, the air grew so thin that a man would lose consciousness in seconds without oxygen. Inside, the crew fought the war in sweaters rather than heavy sheepskin jackets, watching their instruments glow in a dim red light as frost formed on the windows. It was aviation science pushed to the limits. The bomber's defensive systems were equally advanced. 5 remote-controlled gun turrets, guided by analog computers, could automatically calculate lead, distance, and bullet trajectory. A gunner needed only to lock onto a target. The system did the mathematics at lightning speed. This gave the B-29 accuracy and firepower unmatched by any bomber in existence. To Japan, it was not just a machine. It was a new species of aircraft. Yet this technological marvel came at a cost. Sparkle's $3 billion in wartime spending. More than the atomic bomb project. Sparkle's nearly 4,000 aircraft built. Across giant production lines in Kansas, Georgia, and Washington. Sparkle's complexity that pushed workers and engineers to exhaustion. The engines, the powerful Wright R-3350, were the heart of the design and its greatest weakness. They overheated during takeoff and caught fire mid-flight. During early training and ferry missions, dozens of B-29s crashed before ever seeing combat. Every sortie demanded intense ground maintenance. Every flight tested the limits of aviation engineering. But when those engines worked, they delivered something extraordinary. Airplane departure range, over 3,200 miles, enough to reach Japan from the Marianas. Mountain altitude, over 31,000 feet, higher than any Japanese interceptor. High voltage speed, over 350 miles per hour, faster than many enemy fighters. Japanese intelligence officers, reviewing captured technical reports, refused to believe such combined performance was possible. Even the elite Nakajima Ki-44 and Ki-84 Japan's fastest fighters, struggled to reach similar heights, and only in desperate emergency climbs that drained fuel and left little maneuvering power. The Empire's aircraft had been optimized for turning dogfights and light construction, a philosophy developed in the 1930s, before radar and high-altitude warfare changed the world. Lightweight frames gave the Zero incredible agility, but at a deadly cost. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and limited supercharging. In the thin air above 30,000 feet, these aircraft became sluggish, underpowered, and nearly blind from frozen canopies. Japan could see the intruders on radar, but it could not reach them. As B-29 squadrons began their operations from China and later from the Marianas, the Imperial High Command faced a crisis. Their cities lay beneath a bomber that outclassed every defender in the arsenal. Their factories were exposed. Their people were vulnerable. And their engineers, once confident, now confronted a weapon beyond their predictions. Every air raid reinforced a chilling realization. Japan had underestimated the industrial and technological strength of the United States. High above their homeland, a new kind of war was arriving, one waged not with individual heroism, but with altitude, speed, and overwhelming engineering power. And the Japanese fighter pilots tasked with defending the empire would soon discover what it meant to be powerless in the sky. For the Japanese fighter pilots of 1944, the first encounters with the B-29 were disorienting and humiliating. Men trained to engage in swirling, Aggressive aerial duels suddenly found themselves staring upward, helpless, as silver bombers cruised far above reach. Radar controllers shouted altitude reports. Pilots pushed throttles to maximum power, engines screaming. Aircraft climbed until cockpits rattled and wings shook. Then, inevitably, performance collapsed. The fighter stalled or lost power long before reaching the bomber stream. The B-29s glowed faintly in the sunlight miles above. Indifferent. For the first time in the war, Japanese pilots felt what it was like to be prey without teeth. Some still tried. Ki-44 interceptors, fitted with special rocket-assisted boosters, clawed their way upward. A few desperate pilots even removed guns and armor to lighten the load, making their own planes more vulnerable than ever. They approached the Superfortress formations only to discover a new obstacle. The B-29 could shoot back with terrifying accuracy. Remote-controlled turrets swiveled automatically, tracking attackers. Cannon shells and heavy machine gun bursts cut through thin Japanese aircraft skins. Pilots who had once dominated the Pacific sky were now shredded by computing firepower. The psychological impact was enormous. Where Japan's airmen had been hunters, they were suddenly the hunted, climbing almost vertically into death. Losses mounted. Morale thinned. Meanwhile, inside the B-29s, a different kind of pressure grew. The aircraft may have been advanced, but it was not forgiving. Turbulence at 30,000 feet could tear metal. Enemy fire was deadly even at great heights. Oxygen failures could send crewmen stumbling into unconsciousness. Every mission tested nerves. The cold seeped into bones. Breath crystallized in masks. Anxiety came at 200 miles per hour. And yet, those inside the bomber also carried hope. The belief that the war could be ended from above, sparing the bloody beach assaults that had characterized the Pacific campaign so far. Below them, Japanese civilians experienced the raids in a different reality. They did not see high-tech bombers or tactical altitudes, only distant thunder in the night and a shattering rain of incendiaries or high explosives. Parents shielded children in dark shelters. Priests prayed. Fire brigades rushed into collapsing neighborhoods. The defenselessness was total. But perhaps the most dramatic struggle took place not in the skies or on the ground, but behind closed doors in Tokyo's engineering offices. Japan's best designers examined wreckage from crashed B-29s, measuring alloys, inspecting oxygen systems, and studying the intricate remote turrets. They took notes with grim respect. They debated new engine superchargers, pressurization systems, and emergency fighter designs. Reports came back with the same conclusion. The B-29 represented a technological leap Japan could not match in time. Even when the empire mobilized its strongest new designs, the Ki-84, the J-2M Raiden, and the experimental Shinden, production delays, material shortages, and fuel exhaustion crippled any chance of altering the war. The B-29 was not simply a bomber. It was proof that Japan was fighting a nation with an entirely different scale of industrial power. Every pilot, every engineer, every citizen could feel that reality growing heavier with each raid. And as American bombers pressed deeper into the heart of the empire, new perspectives emerged, each more desperate than the last. On paper, high-altitude bombing was meant to spare Japan massive destruction. American officers planned for surgical strikes, precise attacks on aircraft factories, steelworks, and oil refineries. It was a strategy built on altitude, technology, and daylight accuracy. But the sky over Japan did not cooperate. High winds, the powerful jet stream, ripped across the home islands at speeds up to 200 miles per hour. Bombs dropped from perfect formations scattered wildly, missing factories by city blocks. Pilots wrestled for control, engines strained, navigation faltered. Some formations drifted miles off course. Precision became a gamble. Japan recognized the narrow window of vulnerability. Fighters lurked above the clouds, waiting for bombers forced lower by turbulence or fuel concerns. Anti-aircraft gunners learned to anticipate the shifting patterns and time their barges with increasing success. Every raid meant new B-29s failing to return. Meanwhile, Japanese civilians watching from the ground began to understand a terrible duality. The higher the Americans flew, the safer they were, and the more untouchable the war became. No kamikaze could reach them. No flak burst could reliably find them. They were phantoms in the sky. Morale cracked not only among defenders, but among civilians who now felt abandoned by the very gods the Empire had sworn protected Japan. Inside the B-29, the war changed personalities. Aircrews had to adapt to fighting an enemy they could rarely see. Battle became mechanical numbers, altitude charts, oxygen levels, radio formations. The kill-or-be-killed intensity of low-altitude air combat vanished into abstract dots on radar and distant flashes of tracer fire. The psychological disconnect troubled many crewmen. They were inflicting destruction, yet the suffering below was hidden beneath the clouds. The distance insulated them and haunted them. Meanwhile, Japan's leadership grew increasingly frantic. The shock wasn't only military, it was ideological. Imperial propaganda had long insisted that Japanese spirit could defeat American industry. But the B-29 represented industry beyond imagination. Factories building machines that built machines. Assembly lines so vast that thousands of rivets went into a single wing section without slowing production. Aluminum, fuel, rubber, materials Japan could no longer obtain except in fragments. Technological disparity turned into strategic suffocation. Japan experimented with desperate countermeasures. White heavy checkmark special altitude-boosting fuels. White heavy checkmark cannon-armed interceptors attacking head-on. White heavy checkmark giant barrage balloons. White heavy checkmark old fighters stripped of guns to gain a few more meters of climb. White heavy checkmark ramming tactics. Pilots turning their aircraft into weapons. Each attempt came with higher losses and lower morale. To the Americans watching through bombsight crosshairs, it seemed like the Empire was running out of air. To the Japanese citizens huddled beneath collapsing rooftops, it felt like the skies had turned foreign, no longer under the Emperor's protection. To the engineers examining wrecked superfortresses, the war had become a race already lost. A race that altitude alone could not explain. Yet the most decisive change was still ahead. A shift in strategy. That would bring the bombers lower, not higher, and unleash firestorms unlike anything the world had ever seen, because altitude had been a shield. But soon, altitude would become a weapon. By late 1944, B-29 squadrons operating from the Mariana Islands were growing frustrated. Bomb-aiming technology like the Norden bombsight was precise in theory, but Japanese winds erased predictability. Industrial targets remained standing. The destruction was limited. Losses mounted. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the XXI Bomber Command, had a reputation for cold, unsentimental logic. He studied the failures and came to a controversial conclusion. To win the air war against Japan, the bombers would have to come down from the heavens. In December 1944 and January 1945, test missions proved the idea. Flying at lower altitude meant avoiding the violent jet stream and placing bombs with far more accuracy. But it also meant entering the range of Japan's guns and fighters. Yet another factor soon tipped the scale. Japanese air defenses were collapsing. Fuel scarcity kept many fighters grounded. Replacement pilots had minimal training, barely enough to take off, let alone intercept high-speed bombers. Flak batteries lacked shells. And radar stations were increasingly blind after months of American island hopping and submarine warfare disrupted supply lines. LeMay made his decision. The B-29 would switch to low-altitude night bombing, focusing not on factories, but on the wooden cities below. Firebombing. The strategy became fully realized on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, during a massive raid over Tokyo. The bombers departed Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, hundreds of superfortresses, wings heavy with incendiaries. They descended to altitudes as low as 5,000 to 7,000 feet. Their engines grew louder over Japan, no longer ghosts in the sky but a roaring mechanical tide. This time Japan saw them coming. Searchlights locked on. Sirens screamed. Fighters scrambled, though few made contact. Anti-aircraft guns barked. But the B-29s pressed forward, drop doors yawning open. What followed is remembered as one of the deadliest air raids in human history. Clusters of incendiaries burst across eastern Tokyo. Phosphorus and napalm spread like molten storms, igniting homes built of wood and paper. Fire brigades were overwhelmed in minutes. Narrow streets became rivers of flame. Families fled through smoke-choked air as the firestorm consumed entire districts. The city's defenses, designed for high-altitude precision raids, were powerless against this tactic. From the air, the view was surreal. A glowing orange abyss stretching outward, swallowing neighborhoods block by block. Crews reported seeing whirlwinds of fire spiraling upward thousands of feet. Temperatures on the ground reached infernal levels. Oxygen vanished. Refugees suffocated inside bomb shelters that turned into furnaces. When daylight returned, more than 100,000 people were dead, and over 1 million were left homeless. Tokyo had been crippled. Japan now understood that the superfortress was no longer fighting at the edge of possibility. It had adapted, and the consequences were apocalyptic. Still, the psychological shock for Japan's engineers went deeper than fire. The B-29 had conquered altitude, and now it had conquered tactics. What once seemed untouchable was now unstoppable. And as the flames of Tokyo faded into thick columns of black smoke, Japan's leaders faced a realization too heavy for denial. The empire could not protect its people from the sky. The burning of Tokyo was only the beginning. New raids awaited Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, each with fewer defenses left to resist the metal giants overhead. After Tokyo's devastation, there was no pause. Night after night, waves of B-29s thundered toward Japan's cities. Osaka's port burned. Nagoya's aircraft works collapsed. Kobe's docks were rendered useless. In April and May 1945 alone, incendiaries turned more than 60% of Japan's major urban areas to ash. The empire's fighters rose when they could, often outdated, underpowered, or flown by pilots with barely 100 hours of training. Ramming attacks, once a desperate tactic, became official doctrine. Men launched themselves into the massive bombers not out of strategy, but because it was the only chance to make contact. They died in flashes of twisted metal. The B-29 formations kept going. Anti-aircraft shells burst among the low-flying bombers, but gunners inside the superfortresses fired back with relentless precision. Hundreds of guns lit the sky in dueling arcs of tracer fire. Yet Japan's ammunition supply dwindled with every engagement. Even oxygen became a scarce commodity for pilots climbing into combat. Japan's wartime industry, already strangled by submarine warfare and shortages of steel and fuel, crumbled under the inescapable pressure from above. The Nakajima and Mitsubishi plants, where once the Zero and other fighters had rolled off assembly lines in triumph, now lay in ruins, roofs collapsed, machinery buried under fire-hardened rubble. The airfields that remained operational were pocked with bomb craters. Mechanics worked without spare parts, stripping wrecks to keep a few aircraft airborne. Some bases had fuel for only a single sortie per pilot each day, sometimes less. Against this collapse, the B-29 evolved once more. New tactics, new formations, new incendiary patterns. Even mining missions, Operation Starvation, choked Japan's harbors, preventing coal and food from reaching the home islands. It was a nation suffocating from heights beyond imagination. Japan's leadership watched with dread as the sky itself turned enemy. For centuries, the emperor had symbolized divine protection from above. Now, every sunset signaled another approaching storm of fire. In May 1945, radar operators received a report unlike the others. A single aircraft, flying higher and faster than usual, cut across Japan's airspace. Pilots scrambled but were too late to intercept. That lone B-29 belonged to the 509th Composite Group, testing routes and procedures for a new mission type that no Japanese strategist could foresee. A weapon that Japan's engineers could not have imagined when they first doubted the B-29's abilities. A weapon that did not rely on altitude or speed to break the empire, but on something far more devastating. As B-29s continued to flatten cities and ports, American scientists finalized a project that would turn a single bomber into a force capable of ending wars with one bomb. In July 1945, leaflets dropped from the sky warned civilians that more destruction was coming. Many ignored them. What more could be done that had not already been done? The answer arrived on the morning of August 6, 1945, when a single, unusual B-29 named Enola approached Hiroshima. No fighter could reach it. No flak could stop it. Japan's final air defenses were smoke and symbolism. It released one bomb. The flash erased a city. 3 days later, Bockscar unleashed the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, again from a height unchallenged by the defenders below. The Superfortress, once feared for its altitude alone, had now become the deliverer of the atomic age. Japan's engineers no longer questioned whether the B-29 could fly higher than their fighters. They asked instead whether Japan could survive at all. The sky had rendered its verdict. And as the final raids ended, the empire looked into its future and saw only surrender. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the war in the Pacific ended, but the consequences of the B-29 campaign were only beginning to be understood. The aircraft had not merely destroyed buildings. It had dismantled the pillars of an entire wartime society. Japan's major industrial centers, once the pride of the empire, were reduced to fractured steel and ash. Mitsubishi's engine workshops in Nagoya, the core of fighter production, lay silent. Yokohama's shipyards, crippled. Osaka's textile districts, once crucial for military supplies, burned to their foundations. In total, fire over 67 Japanese cities attacked. Fire 40% to 90% of each city's urban area destroyed. Fire hundreds of thousands dead. Fire millions displaced. Fire industry reduced to a fraction of pre-war output. The empire that had begun the war with confidence in its pilots and warships ended it under firestorms from above. And yet, the psychological aftermath ran even deeper. The B-29 had turned Japan's own skies, once a symbol of national purity and divine protection, into a constant reminder of vulnerability. Civilians no longer looked upward with pride, but in fear. Night air raid sirens haunted their sleep long after the war ended. Survivors recalled the thunder of engines and the suffocating heat of firestorms as memories they could never escape. For Japan's airmen, the end was equally painful. Many pilots who once fought with unmatched skill returned home to cities destroyed, communities scattered. They had been trained to duel in the sky, but faced a foe they could barely reach. Veterans often described the shame of climbing until their engines failed, watching bombers glide untouched overhead. Engineers faced their own reckoning. Interrogations by Allied analysts revealed the shock that swept Japan's technical community as they examined captured B-29s. Reports described the bomber as 2 generations ahead of Japanese designs, particularly in pressurization, fire control, and metallurgy. Many factors, lack of raw resources, insufficient industrial capacity, and rushed wartime priorities, meant Japan simply could not build anything comparable. The contrast was stark. United States, America mass-produced technological breakthroughs. Japan relied on craftsmanship that could not scale. Post-war studies further revealed how the B-29 forced Japan to realize the new rules of industrial warfare. Altitude matters more than maneuverability. Armor and survivability trump lightness and agility. Industry wins air wars, not individual heroism. Control of the sky means control of the war. When the occupation began, thousands of grounded and scorched aircraft sat abandoned across airfields like Mitaka, Tachikawa, and Nagoya. Many of Japan's most advanced prototypes, the J-7W Shinden, Ki-87, and R-2Y Cayenne, never progressed beyond a handful of test flights. They were the remnants of an aviation race that Japan joined too late. The B-29 did not defeat Japan alone, but it exposed the fatal truth. The empire's military vision belonged to the past. The future belonged to those who controlled the sky with science. And as Japan began the long process of rebuilding a peaceful nation, the ruins left behind by the Superfortress served as a stark reminder of what unchecked war from the air could unleash. In the months following surrender, the ruins of Japan's cities revealed the full scale of the B-29's impact. Streets once crowded with factories, shops, and homes became open plains of charred foundations. Survivors sifted through rubble not just for belongings, but for fragments of a world that no longer existed. The destruction forced Japan to confront a devastating reality. Its defeat did not come from battleships sunk or islands captured. It came from losing the air. The B-29 campaign demonstrated the decisive power of strategic bombing. Pushpin industry crippled. Without factories, aircraft, fuel, or steel, Japan could not continue to fight. Pushpin supply lines severed. Minefields laid by B-29s shut down maritime transport, choking vital resources. Pushpin civilian morale shattered. The belief in divine protection collapsed under the weight of nightly firestorms. Pushpin leadership isolated. With communication and infrastructure destroyed, command struggled to function. These impacts converged into a single strategic truth. Japan's war machine collapsed from above. Even atomic bombs, horrific and unprecedented, were delivered by B-29s. Their existence proved the bomber's dominance more than any statistic could measure. The aircraft that once inspired disbelief in Japanese intelligence files had become the vessel of a new age of warfare. Across the Pacific, the United States drew its own lessons. The B-29 had validated a new doctrine. That air power, if technologically superior and intelligently applied, could end a war without a decisive land invasion. The Superfortress became the blueprint for a modern military. Long-range strategic bombing. Technological supremacy over enemy defenses. Precision evolving into overwhelming force. Within a few years, the B-29's design matured into the B-50, then the intercontinental B-36 Peacemaker, and ultimately into nuclear-capable aircraft that would define the early Cold War. Pressurization, advanced fire control systems, and long-range logistics became core standards in aviation. Japan, for its part, also transformed. Demilitarized and determined to rebuild, it turned its engineering talent toward peaceful innovation. Automobiles, electronics, commercial aviation. Instead of fighters, Japanese companies would excel in technologies that shaped global prosperity. The loss became a foundation for renewal, yet the memory of the B-29 never faded. To those who lived through the raids, the sound of radial engines overhead was a reminder of the moment the war's outcome became inevitable. It symbolized the turning of history's page, from battles fought by armies and fleets to wars decided by altitude, industrial power, and the ability to strike from distant skies. In countless war museum exhibits, rusted engine nacelles, fragments of fuselage, and twisted gun barrels from crashed B-29s are displayed with quiet reverence. They tell the story of a machine that Japan once believed could not exist, but ultimately changed the course of nations. And in the wreckage-strewn airfields of 1945, one idea became indisputable. The future of warfare would belong to those who commanded the air with innovation and overwhelming force. But the story does not end in the ashes of war. Because what the B-29 accomplished over Japan reshaped how the world understood victory, and how fragile it becomes when technology outpaces imagination. From the skies over Tokyo to the tunnels of airbases on Guam and Tinian, the B-29 Superfortress left a legacy far larger than the war it was built to end. It was not just a bomber. It was a symbol of a rapidly changing world. A world where industry and technology became as decisive as courage and sacrifice. The men who flew these missions were often barely in their 20s. They endured freezing temperatures, oxygen failures, night fighters, and engine fires over thousands of miles of ocean. They fought not only the enemy, but the limits of what machines and humans were thought capable of. Many never returned. To the Japanese civilians who survived the fiery infernos below, the memory is equally profound. The night sky that once offered comfort became an omen of unimaginable destruction. For countless families, the war ended not with soldiers storming ashore, but with flames descending from silent shadows above. The B-29 forced a reckoning. What happens when technological progress outpaces humanity's ability to control its consequences? It marked the end of one era of warfare, and the frightening beginning of another. Because once a bomber could cross an ocean, reach its target, and reshape an entire city in a single night, every nation understood that distance no longer meant safety. The race for air supremacy would only accelerate, leading to jets, missiles, nuclear payloads, and a world permanently living in the shadow of the skies. Yet, from this devastation also came rebirth. Out of the ruins, Japan rebuilt not an empire, but a future, one defined by innovation, peace, and resilience. The superfortress that once threatened to erase the nation became a reminder of why war must never again reach such heights. Today, only a few B-29s remain. One still flies, its polished aluminum skin reflecting the sunlight like a ghost of history refusing to fade. Veterans and families gather to watch it take to the air, hearing once more that deep thunder of engines that changed the world. And for a moment, time stands still, because the B-29 is more than metal and rivets, more than a weapon. It is a story of ambition and consequences, of bravery and tragedy, of human potential and the cost of unleashing it. This was the Superfortress, the machine that conquered the sky and forever changed the ground beneath it.